Tonight we start reading Trouble in Bugland, a collection of Inspector Mantis's mysteries. This one is the case of the missing butterfly. The disappearance of Miss Juliana Butterfly brought two familiar figures through the fog, one of them tall and slow-moving, the other short and quick. "A most disturbing thing," said Dr. Hopper, the shorter of the two, and a regular assistant to Inspector Mantis, the lean and keen-sighted scholar of crime, who now spoke in the swirling mist. "Miss Juliana is a circus performer, is she not?" "A bareback rider," Dr. Hopper tapped his cane lightly on the pave. "One of the loveliest creatures ever to circle the ring." "I see," said Inspector Mantis, with a sidelong glance toward his friend. "And did you enjoy yesterday's performance?" Dr. Hopper looked up with surprise. "Why, how did you know I was there?" "That bit of straw which still clings to your trouser cuff." He touched Hopper's scarf. "A piece of peanut shell here, and," Inspector Mantis gestured with his long arm, "you have cotton candy in your moustache." Dr. Hopper frowned and tidied himself up. "I must say, Mantis, you amaze me. As usual, is nothing hidden from you?" "Much is hidden, Doctor, much too much." And saying so, Inspector Mantis fell silent, his long arms locking behind his back as he walked, a sign that he was giving the mystery careful thought. For Miss Juliana was not the only butterfly to have disappeared of late. Dozens of the beautiful creatures had vanished, to none knew where. The inspector's smouldering pipe went out, and the city blocks went by, one after the other, but still he said nothing until the outskirts of the city had been reached and the sounds of a circus came from ahead. "Well then, Doctor, since you've been here before, I suggest you lead the way." Dr. Hopper obliged, conducting them through the circus grounds to the main tent where Miss Juliana had last performed. They were met there by P.T. Barnworm, the owner of the circus. "Terrible, terrible, terrible," Barnworm wrung his many hands. "Miss Juliana was a star performer." "We share your feelings," said Dr. Hopper. "She was wonderful to behold." P.T. Barnworth took a challenging step toward Mantis. "Can you find her?" "We shall do our best." Inspector Mantis was already looking toward the centre ring. He pointed toward a spot halfway around. "I see it was from precisely there that she was abducted." P.T. Barnworth raised his eyebrows. "How did you know?" "Well, would you have any objections to my looking more closely?" Inspector Mantis, not waiting for an answer, stepped toward the circle of sawdust. P.T. Barnworm turned to Dr. Hopper. "It happened in the middle of the show. The lights went out for a second. When they came back on, Miss Juliana was gone." "A wretched business." Dr. Hopper gazed at the ring where just last night he'd so enjoyed the sight of Miss Juliana balancing on her trained horseflies. Now the ring was miserably empty, save for Inspector Mantis snooping around it, magnifying glass in his hand. "What is he doing?" asked Barnworm. "His ways are peculiar," said Dr. Hopper, "but I dare say he's already found something." Inspector Mantis came out of his crouch and put his magnifying glass away. "Well?" asked Barnworm, cracking his whip nervously at his side as if Mantis were an unpredictable animal in his circus menagerie. "We must bid you good day now, Mr. Barnworm, and trust that your show will go on as usual tonight. If you have any other butterflies in your company, I suggest you keep them under close watch." Inspector Mantis turned toward the exit, and Dr. Hopper followed him. "Well, Mantis," asked the doctor impatiently, "what did you find?" "Miss Juliana was seized by a gang of assassin bugs. Their traces are everywhere around the ring, and at this doorway as well." "A moment, Mantis," said Dr. Hopper. I have something sticky on my shoe. Exactly, said Mantis, waiting until Hopper had removed his shoe, and he then pointed toward the sole. That sticky substance which you have just stepped in is of most singular kind, exuded only by the assassin bug. You'll note the dust clinging to it, another characteristic of the assassin. They gather dust wherever they go. In this case, it was sawdust which allowed them to pass unnoticed into the very centre of the ring. They appeared to be no more than piles of sawdust, and then they struck. Dr. Hopper laced up his shoe once more. But why did they seize Miss Juliana? Of what possible use could a bareback riding butterfly be to them? Of inhuman use, so cruel as to compare to nothing we've ever dealt with before. Mantis put up the collar of his cloak against the damp wind. Let us hurry, Doctor, before the threads of this case are blown away by the winds of time. A carriage clicked its way along through that part of the city where strangers are neither welcome nor safe. In every doorway dangerous figures lurk, and on every corner there were signs of evil omen. When the carriage stopped, it was a cautious Dr. Hopper who stepped down. I take it, Mantis, that it's absolutely essential for us to be here. Dr. Hopper looked nervously around him. I am well known at this cafe, Mantis pointed with the stem of his pipe, and no one shall trouble us. Dr. Hopper took a solid grip on his cane and entered the cafe with Mantis. On all sides daggers gleamed, but Mantis made his way calmly through the crowd, choosing a table in the corner of the room. Make yourself comfortable, Doctor, for I believe we shall have to be here for a while. I don't like this place, Mantis. Dr. Hopper sat down, careful first to touch his wallet to see that it had not been picked already. An indecent lot, said Mantis, coldly eyeing the deadly assortment of characters at the other tables, but useful. Through two swinging doors at the kitchen a waiter emerged with several arms bearing numerous steaming dishes and drinks, which he distributed to the hungry, muttering crowd. Then, turning, he slithered toward the most recently occupied table. Good evening, Inspector. His false, shallow smile fell on Mantis. What brings you here tonight? Usually it means you are in search of someone. Usually, Inspector Mantis rubbed the ashen bowl of his pipe. Bring us 2 cups of rose nectar and a plate of bee bread. The waiter withdrew with a sinister glide, and Dr. Hopper stared across the table at his lean, bony friend. How can you eat in a den like this, Mantis? I'm appalled. We have a long night ahead of us, Doctor, and if I'm not mistaken, it will carry us far afield. You'd be wise to eat while you can. The fog beyond the cafe window turned to a faint drizzle, and the crowd came and went, while the lamps burned on. Inspector Mantis, after touching a few morsels of the food, fell into a deep meditation, and Dr. Hopper finally allowed himself to eat the entire dish of bee bread. But dash it all, Mantis, are we to stay here forever? He looked at his apparently rigid companion. No, said Mantis, as if suddenly waking, for there is our thread. He nodded toward the door where a vicious-looking tick had just entered, carrying a heavy satchel. And what treacherous profession is he practising, I wonder? Asked Dr. Hopper, following the tick's stealthy progress through the shadows. He is a seller of poisons, Doctor, whose names I'm sure would be familiar to you. Poisons? Well, this is the place for it, I must say. Indeed, said Mantis, and that is why we are here. But what have poisons to do with Miss Juliana Butterfly? Everything, my dear Hopper, simply everything. Inspector Mantis leaned his elbows on the table and regarded the poison seller's approach with interest. The tick was doing a lively business, handing out numerous corked vials of his noxious wares, for which he received payment in good measure from the unwholesome inhabitants of the cafe. You there, Mantis spoke with cool indifference. The tick turned. Let the buyer beware. He sidled closer to the table and laid his black bag down in front of Mantis. For what I sell is lethal. Have you, Mantis leaned towards him, hydrogen cyanide? Newly added to my line. The tick smiled and dug into his bag, then placed a shining little vial on the table. Will there be anything else? he asked, still smiling, his eyes gleaming as he took payment from the inspector. I should like a heart poison, if you have one. Certainly. The tick rummaged in his bag again and placed another bright little bottle down. A most powerful cardinalide. You could kill a horse with it. Dr. Hopper shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The poison seller gave off an unpleasant odour, to which was added the further unpleasantness of his deadly wares, now glittering brightly on the table. And Mantis still wasn't done with his purchases. Strychnine, said the inspector. Do you have it? Another new addition. The tick went into his bag again. You've caught me at a good time. The third gleaming vial was set on the table. Excellent, said the Inspector Mantis, placing all 3 vials in his cloak. These are just what I've been looking for. Should you have need of more, you can find me here. The tick wrapped his black cape around himself and moved off through the crowd toward the door. Now then, Doctor, said Mantis, standing quickly, the chase is on. He and Hopper hurried out of the cafe into the drizzling rain in time to see the tick alighting to a carriage. Mantis raised a long arm, signalling another cab, and instructed the driver to follow. But what is the connection, Mantis? Dr. Hopper sank into the carriage seat, shaking the rain off his derby. How does this poison-selling tick link us to Miss Juliana Butterfly? Defenceless butterflies, murmured Inspector Mantis, almost as if to himself. Yes, exactly, said Dr. Hopper quickly. Poor defenceless creatures being preyed upon by whom? But are they defenceless, Doctor? Mantis sat up sharply. Think, what is the butterfly's defence? Why, Dr. Hopper tapped himself lightly on the forehead with his cane as he thought for a moment. I suppose it's those big bright eyes butterflies have painted on their wings. They look like the eyes of a hawk or a cat or some such creature, and birds who might eat the butterflies are frightened off. Am I correct? Yes, said Mantis, but there is still another defence connected with poison. By Jove, Mantis! Hopper struck himself on the head with his cane again, to the point of nearly knocking himself unconscious. But he hardly noticed, so great was his excitement. Butterflies contain poison in their bodies, making them very unappetizing morsels to the birds. That's it. Yes, Doctor, that's it precisely. And those 3 poisons are cyanide, cardinalide, and strychnine, which the tick in the carriage ahead of us has for sale. Mantis leaned his head discreetly out the window. His little evening's work is done, I think, and his bag is empty. The tick's carriage was stopping, and Mantis and Hopper hid their faces as their own coach slowly passed by. The tick was descending, black cape flowing, as he stepped into the street and quickly disappeared into a dark row of buildings. Mantis tapped on his driver's window and was already climbing down as the carriage stopped. Dr. Hopper following him into a neighbourhood little better than the one they'd come from. The air was filled with menace. The fog, which had once again set in, cloaked the street. This way, said Inspector Mantis softly, and Dr. Hopper moved with him through a narrow passage between the buildings. Water dripped from a rain gutter somewhere above them, but there was no other noise on either side. Mantis pointed downward to the faint imprint of a footstep left by the tick. More footprints led through the passageway and out the other side into a large courtyard. It was empty, lit by a single lamp which threw a feeble glow through the smoke-like haze. Dr. Hopper wrinkled up his nose. I say, Mantis, he remarked in a whisper, what is that loathsome smell? It is the trail, Doctor. Mantis moved swiftly across the courtyard, pausing only a moment to sniff the air. Dr. Hopper sniffed with him, recalling that the poison seller had given off the same odour, but weaker and less disgusting. What could be the source of such a dreadful stench? Behold, said Mantis, indicating the nameplate on the door directly before them, on which was written, A. Stinkbug, Esquire. Must we? Dr. Hopper was reaching for a handkerchief to cover his nose when Mantis quickly threw out a long arm and pressed them both back into the shadows of the building. The door opened, and the poison seller came out, his bag heavy once again. They watched him pass through the vaporous glow of the courtyard. When his footsteps had faded out of earshot, Inspector Mantis bent low beside a window. With a long, slender tool from his pocket kit, he slipped the window latch and carefully, noiselessly raised the glass. An overwhelming odour struck them. Dr. Hopper reeled back, nearly fainting. Inspector Mantis clutched his arm and drew him through the window as the good doctor struggled again to get the handkerchief to his nose. Gad, what a place! Hopper staggered forward through malodorous clouds that seemed to come from the very walls. He is ahead of us, Mantis indicated a crack of light coming from beneath the door. The doctor supported himself weakly with his cane. As Mantis turned the knob, the door creaked open, and beyond it, sitting in the middle of the room, was a stinkbug, dining on a dish of cabbage. "Who are you?" he asked, looking up suspiciously, with a spoon halfway to his lip. The smell, whether from the cabbage or stinkbug himself, was impossible to bear. Dr. Hopper sank back against the back of the chair, holding his head. Inspector Mantis, swaying dizzily, managed to speak. "It is we who should ask that question of you." I am a stinkbug." "A purveyor of poisons," snapped Mantis, his eyes watering from the smell. "You look pale, sir," said a stinkbug. "May I offer you a drop of something to revive you?" Stinkbug pointed to a stoppered bottle. "A drop indeed." Mantis dizzily gripped the edge of the table, his gaze upon the evil-looking liquid in the bottle. "2 drops, perhaps, for one as tall as you," smiled Stinkbug. "I fear," Mantis took a step backward, his long legs beginning to buckle beneath him. "We must withdraw." He lifted Dr. Hopper from the chair the doctor had collapsed in and assisted him towards the door. "Leaving so soon?" Stinkbug rose from his seat. "But I thought you came to talk about poisons." "Another time, perhaps." Mantis, coughing and choking, dragged the half-unconscious doctor out. Stinkbug laughed. "Did my little home offend you in some way? You seem to be holding your nose." Mantis and Hopper fumbled at the outer door and tumbled drunkenly into the courtyard. Stinkbug slammed the door behind them, and they breathed deeply in the cool night air, recovering their wits. "Upon my soul," said Dr. Hopper, "that was a nauseating encounter, and we learned not a thing." "On the contrary, Doctor," said Mantis, "we now know where Miss Juliana Butterfly is." "We do?" Hopper stared up at his companion, moustache ends twitching with surprise. "Yes, Doctor, we do. The courtyard and the house were scattered with tiny clues. Here is one such." Inspector Mantis handed a tiny sprig of green to Dr. Hopper. "Eh? What's this?" "It is a herb, Doctor, called thyme. Whoever brings the shipments of poison to Stinkbug comes from a place overgrown with thyme." "I see," said Dr. Hopper, putting on his eyeglasses and examining the sprig of thyme more closely. "You'll notice," continued Mantis, "bits of dry, sandy soil clinging to the herb." "Yes, quite right. We have both seen such soil as that, Doctor, in the ruined vineyards of old Grapeleaf, which lies to the south of us. It is a most desolate area, forbidding and austere." "And do you think that's where Miss Juliana Butterfly is held captive?" "I'm certain of it. Look, Doctor, with my magnifying glass." Mantis took out his lens and handed it to Hopper. "Do you see those glittering bits of colour mixed with the sand?" "I do. They are the scales from a butterfly's wings." "Why, so they are." The doctor looked up, his eyes filled with excitement. Mantis smiled. "Our host, a Stinkbug Esquire, thought his game was completely concealed, but those tiny glittering bits of colour were everywhere in his house, on the tablecloth, on the rug, and some, I don't doubt, floating in his cabbage soup." "But this is extraordinary, Mantis. You've solved the case." "Hardly, Doctor, for now we must go and grapple with the fiend of the ruined vineyards, an adversary more powerful than any we have ever faced." "Who is—" The doctor removed his glasses, an anxious question written in his eyes. "The tarantula," said Inspector Mantis, and once again his long arms locked behind his back. Thus, in silence, the two friends marched along, only their footsteps echoing in the shrouded street as they hastened toward the next square in the game, a dark and dangerous one where terrible forces lurked. The train rumbled through the night. Dr. Hopper, asleep in his seat, rocked back and forth against the window. Beside him, a travelling chessboard on his lap, Inspector Mantis amused himself, his mind never happy unless it was engaged in some problem of pursuit. He prepared to move his knight to make the final capture of the enemy king when the train whistle sounded, the carriage jerked, and the pieces fell off the board onto his cloak. Well, well, Doctor. He gathered up the fallen combatants and tucked them back into their little box. It seems we have arrived. Eh? Dr. Hopper looked up sleepily, then stretched and stood. I was dreaming of Miss Juliana Butterfly. Inspector Mantis stepped into the aisle. And what was she doing, pray tell? Performing bareback again on her prancing horsefly. Let us hope that will be the outcome, said Mantis as they descended the steps of the train onto the station platform. But I fear it is a nightmare that awaits us rather than a dream. I would risk anything for Miss Juliana, said Dr. Hopper resolutely. Then I shall ask you to make immediate inquiry of the nearest buyer and seller of gold as to whether any amount of that precious substance has come his way lately, and if so, from whom. Meet me here at the station in an hour. And where are you off to, Mantis? But the inspector was already on his way, calling back over his shoulder. Hurry, Doctor, for the life of Miss Juliana is at stake. Dr. Hopper moved off as quickly as his hopping legs would carry him. In a very little time he found the sign of the Golden Scarab and entered the seller's shop. The scarab, seated at a pair of scales, looked up. May I help you? Is that gold dust you are weighing, sir? Asked the doctor. Are you buying or selling? Snapped the scarab. Neither. Then don't waste my time. The scarab went back to studying his scales. Dr. Hopper placed his hat and cane on the counter. Well, perhaps I am interested. He pointed at the dust. Where is this mined? That, said the scarab, is none of your business. The door swung open behind him, but Dr. Hopper pretended not to notice. Instead, he bent over a display case of golden coins, as if examining them carefully. But from the corner of his eye, he watched a pair of legs come into the view, their shape obliterated by clinging bits of sawdust and sand and sprigs of thyme. The scarab's voice rose in greeting. And how are you this evening? Dr. Hopper raised his eyes a little more and saw a bug whose entire wardrobe was formed of clinging debris. I've come to sell, said the shabby creature in a harsh, low tone, as he dropped a heavy bag on the scarab's counter. You've come to the right place, said the scarab, putting the bag on his scales. Did you have a good trip? The slovenly bug pointed to bits of mud and riverweed that were stuck to his sleeve. The road is bad, and the bridge was nearly washed away, and me with it. Bridge washed out? Dr. Hopper looked up casually from the display case. And where is that? I wouldn't want to run into it. Bitter Rot Road, scowled the bug, where it forks to the right. He picked at his disgusting sleeve again. I've ruined a perfectly good suit. Thank you, said Hopper, as he withdrew toward the door. I shall be on the watch. Now, by George, I must hurry. The street flew beneath his feet as he rushed back toward the railroad station. Before he'd reached it, a carriage pulled in beside him, and Inspector Mantis leaned down from it, pulling him in. Ah, Mantis, I found someone selling gold. From Bitter Rot Road, said Mantis quietly, beyond the river. Was it a dust-covered bug revealed it to you? The assassin gang is everywhere in this unfortunate city, Doctor, their bodies cloaked with trash, their conscience covered in crime. But they are only intermediaries. Our real quarry is ahead of us. He pointed with his pipe as the carriage swung out of the city onto a road lined with dead, rotted grapevines, their branches hanging sad and bare. The carriage bounced and rattled along over the ill-kept road, axles creaking ominously. There, said Mantis, the road forks, and there is the bridge. The driver opened his window and spoke down to them. I'll not risk crossing that. He pointed with his whip at the teetering bridge. Inspector Mantis opened the carriage door. We must proceed on foot, Doctor, but our enemy cannot be far off. Look what grows among the vines. Time, said the doctor, picking off a sprig. The driver of the carriage called down to them. Who is it you seek out here? "The tarantula," said Inspector Mantis. The driver yanked his carriage around, whipped his steeds, and rattled away in a cloud of dust. "Stout fellow," said Mantis, stepping onto the swaying bridge. "A rotter," said Dr. Hopper, gripping his hat brim and balancing himself with his cane. Mantis gave his companion a sly glance. "Perhaps—" The inspector stepped gingerly over a jagged, broken timber. "He's never seen Miss Juliana Butterfly perform?" "Then he has missed the greatest sight of a lifetime," said Dr. Hopper. Together they made their way over the rickety bridge, every stick of it swaying now as the swollen stream knocked it about. No sooner had Mantis and Hopper set foot on the far shore than the whole bridge was swept away like matchsticks on the water. "Well," said Mantis, "now our way is clear. There can be no retreat." "So much the worse for the tarantula," said Dr. Hopper, swinging his cane. Mantis touched Hopper lightly on the back of the neck. "If he stings the cervical ganglia, you are finished." Dr. Hopper paled slightly, but his voice did not waver. "If he is holding Miss Juliana Butterfly captive, he must answer to me." Inspector Mantis swept his eyes over the hillside beyond them. The ground is dry and pebbly. The tarantula's underground manor is near. The two friends paused then as Inspector Mantis began a more careful sweep of the terrain. "Yes, yes, over there and there. Confound it, Mantis, what do you see? I can't make out anything." Mantis laid a hand on Hopper's shoulder and pointed him first in one direction, then another. "Do you see? A beetle's leg here, a wing of a bee over there. There, how ghastly!" A dragonfly's head, baked by the sun, stared at them from the middle of the field. They moved forward with cautious steps. All around them, in every direction, it was barren as the moon, save for the indigestible bits of leg and wing the tarantula had dumped out of its underground home. "There, Hopper, there is the entrance." Mantis pointed to a turret rising out of the earth, decorated by dragonfly skulls. Dr. Hopper swallowed with some difficulty. His knees beginning to tremble. "But," continued Mantis, "we cannot hope to defeat him in his tunnel. He is an absolute master there. Every twist and turn is known to him, and the walls are lined up with webbing up which he can travel like lightning, but in which we would be mired." "But what shall we do then?" asked Dr. Hopper. "We must lure him out," said Mantis. "An excellent idea," said Hopper, his knees ceasing to tremble. "How shall we do it?" "We must climb the turret, Doctor, and play your violin. He will hear it and come after you." "Mantis, I say, Miss Juliana Butterfly is somewhere in there." Mantis pointed to the dark opening of the turret, and Dr. Hopper sighed, shrugging his shoulders, and walked, knees trembling again, toward the tarantula's manor. At the base of the turret he paused and looked back toward Mantis, but the inspector had already disappeared. Hopper braced himself, held his hat, hopped in one bound to the top of the turret. There he began to play, as if to the setting sun, but his coat-tails were hanging into the terrible hole, and his elbows were resting on hollow dragonfly heads. He wished very much to be back at home, sitting in front of a cheerful fire, popping popcorn. But then he thought of Miss Juliana, held prisoner somewhere down in the darkness, and he played louder and more sweetly, as if playing to her. Suddenly, 4 eyes gleamed in the darkness, and then a huge shadow skimmed up the silken walls. Dr. Hopper leapt off the turret, dragonfly heads tumbling with him. He landed lightly and turned to defend himself. He was a foot fighter of some skill. He locked his legs for a swift kick. The sun was blotted out by the great hairy body sailing down through the air towards him. 4 malevolent eyes glittered, and 2 glistening fangs went for his neck. He dodged, kicked into the monster's stomach, but the tarantula only laughed as the kick landed harmlessly against his chest armor. "What a foolish fiddler you are!" The tarantula went for the doctor's jugular vein. The nimble doctor dodged once more, and the tarantula pursued him, laughing. "You think that you can escape me? You're mine now, little fellow." The tarantula's poison fangs opened again, but just as they did so, a long green saw-toothed arm closed around his hairy neck. "Mantis! Thank goodness!" Dr. Hopper hopped out of harm's way, the tarantula held back by the powerful grip of Inspector Mantis. The tarantula struggled against the inspector's iron grasp. He rolled, and Mantis went beneath him, but his grip didn't loosen. "That's it!" shouted Dr. Hopper, hopping about excitedly. "You've got him! Here I come, Mantis!" The doctor leapt in with his cane, trying to knock the tarantula out. A hairy leg tripped him, and a dripping fang stuck him through the shirt front into his chest. The barren landscape suddenly went round. The struggling figures before him became a blur. He staggered backwards, pain shooting through his body. He then stumbled forward again, trying to enter the battle once more. Feebly he struck with his cane. "You got him, man. Just don't let go." Sand and gravel flew about as Mantis and his opponent whirled in the dust. The tarantula's swift legs kicked out in all directions, and his hideous fangs snapped at the sky, poison shining on the needle tips. His monstrous body sprung upward in the air, convulsed by murderous passion. But when he dropped down, Mantis still clung to his throat, his own body in some dark trance of concentrated power. Hopper had seen such battles before. Once those forearms of Mantis's had locked, no force could open them. Not even a machine of death like the tarantula, whose legs were kicking less fiercely now. The spider's glittering eyes fluttered as the vice-like grip of the inspector tightened ever tighter on the hairy throat. A moment more, and the tarantula collapsed, unconscious, on the ground. "Quickly, doctor!" Handcuffs flashed, and they set to shackling the monster. Hopper's hands trembled with the iron cuffs, his arms cold and aching, but he managed to close the links around the legs of the hairy fiend. Mantis's own cuffs clicked shut, and he stepped back from their still unconscious prisoner. "That should do it. Let us enter the dungeon." Wearily, Dr. Hopper followed Inspector Mantis over to the top of the turret and into the dark hole. Carefully they picked their way down the wall, avoiding the network of sticky threads. The subterranean chamber went deep into the earth. Dr. Hopper's vision was blurred, his legs weak, and he groped his way along beside Mantis, through the ghastly labyrinth. Imprisoned fireflies provided the light, and monstrous trophies covered the silken walls. At every turning, there was evidence of some new outrage perpetrated against the citizens of the fields and hills surrounding the manor. Beetle-horn furniture, fly-wing drapes, fur rugs made out of bumblebees. "I shan't live to see the end of it," thought Dr. Hopper, feeling the poison spreading slowly through his veins. The tarantula's fang had missed the cervical ganglia, but had nonetheless penetrated deeply, and the doctor knew he was doomed. But he held on, wanting to see Miss Juliana safe and out of this terrible place. "There, Hopper," said Inspector Mantis, "that barred door." "Yes," said Hopper weakly. "Let's open it quickly." They lifted the beam that held it, swung it open, and then stared in amazement at the saddest sight either of them had ever seen. Dozens of butterflies chained to the walls, their wings naked and bare. "They've been stripped of their gold," cried the doctor, aghast. "Yes," said Mantis, "it is as I feared." "How foul!" stammered the doctor. "An unspeakable crime." "Help us!" cried the butterflies. "Loosen our chains!" "At once," said the Dr. Hopper, and went to the only butterfly in the room who had not yet been violated, Miss Juliana. He removed his derby and bowed before the imprisoned beauty. Then, with hands that were growing more numb with every second, he freed her from the chains. "Oh, thank you," sobbed Miss Juliana, falling into his arms. "I was to be next. My wings were to be stripped this night." "It shall never happen, dear lady," said the doctor, attempting to smile, but the poison had spread to his neck, his face, his entire body. He swayed before her, then stumbled backwards and collapsed. "Doctor!" Mantis rushed to his side. "It's nothing." Hopper looked up weakly, still trying to smile. It was most embarrassing to be dying this way in front of Miss Juliana. "The tarantula gave me a glancing wound." "There's no such thing as a glancing wound with a tarantula," said Mantis, hurrying the doctor to his feet. The other butterflies were now freeing each other, and one of them spoke up. "I heard the tarantula talking to the assassin bugs one night about the only antidote for his bite." "Yes," snapped Mantis, "and what is it?" "The victim must dance." "Yes, of course," cried Mantis. "How could I have forgotten? The tarantella, the dance of the tarantula. It is the only cure known." "Dance, doctor," cried the butterflies. "Dance with us." Hopper shook his head, but Mantis spoke in his ear. "You must. It will drive the poison from your system." Hopper's fiddle had fallen to the floor, and one of the butterflies picked it up and began to play. "Dance with me, Doctor," said Miss Juliana, taking him into her arms. The fiddling butterfly gave forth a tune in 6/8 time, and Miss Juliana spun the Doctor around. He staggered with her, staring blankly into her iridescent eyes. His dream had come true of seeing her safe, but as Mantis had said, a nightmare had awaited them too, and he was falling into it, into the nightmare of a chilled, poisoned heart. But Miss Juliana held him up, her strong circus arms carrying his weight and whirling him around to the tune, so that his heart somehow kept pumping life, and his legs kept moving, though they seemed mired in lead. "Dance, dance, 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 dance," the butterflies called, clapped out in time, and Miss Juliana whispered in his ear, so that the beating of the music became the beat of his heart, beating for her. His right leg suddenly twitched, shot through with life, then his left one followed, twitching more crazily. "The poison is moving," shouted Mantis. "Faster!" The fiddler increased his tempo, and Hopper's legs went into a spasm, kicking as if by themselves, as Miss Juliana whirled him to the mad rhythm of the tarantella. The sweat poured from his brow in bitter streams of poison that dripped into his shirt collar, poisoning him no more. He felt a lightness returning to his limbs, felt his heart responding, as Miss Juliana whispered, "You dance divinely, Doctor." "Oh, not really, I'm just hopping about." He was gliding now, the poison thinned out inside him and his strength coming back. He turned with her, clicking his heels, as the fiddle went into a racing finish, faster and faster and faster. His legs followed, kicking the last of the poison away as the butterflies shouted, "Hurrah!" and lifted him onto their wings, onto their shoulders. "Here now, I say." They carried him out of the dungeon and through the dark winding tunnel into the light of day once more. P.T. Barnworm escorted Dr. Hopper and Inspector Mantis to a ringside seat. "Gentlemen, you have a free pass to this circus for life." Mantis and Hopper sat down, popcorn on their laps and cotton candy in their hands. A balloon was attached to the doctor's derby. "Well," he said, "I hope Miss Juliana has recovered." "Entirely," said P.T. Barnworm. "The few flecks of gold she lost from her wings have grown back." "Do my eyes deceive me?" said Inspector Mantis, "or is that the lady in question coming toward us now?" P.T. Barnworm extended his arm toward Miss Juliana. "Your friends have come to see you." "I was hoping you would," said Miss Juliana, her costume glittering brightly as she joined them in the front row. "Did you know?" She raised her head to the trapeze above, where a brilliantly robed performer was waiting to take the bar. "I'm going to be married." "Congratulations!" Inspector Mantis put his cotton candy down and shook Miss Juliana's hand. Dr. Hopper shook it too, but his voice was hardly more than a whisper. "May you enjoy every happiness." The horseflies came trotting out at that moment, and Miss Juliana leapt gracefully upward, straddling two of them at once, and they carried her away to the cracking of P.T. Barnworm's whip. Inspector Mantis looked at his friend. "Did I detect something in your voice just now when Miss Juliana informed us of—" "Bosh!" said Dr. Hopper. "Don't be absurd." "I see," said Mantis. Miss Juliana circled by her prancing steeds, her radiant wings floating out behind her. "She's a friend, no more than that," said Dr. Hopper as she went by. "You have cotton candy in your moustache," said Mantis.